The skyline of Chicago was a jagged crown of glass and steel, and at its peak sat Arthur Marx. To the world, he was a saint in a charcoal suit, a philanthropist who moved millions with a stroke of a pen. Arthur Marx didn't inherit his billions, he engineered them. In the late 1980s, Arthur founded Marx Logistics and Data, a company that revolutionized global supply chains using early predictive algorithms. His wealth was built on the idea that any delay or chaos in a system was a moral failing. Arthur was once part of a formidable trio, himself, his younger brother Elias, and his wife Eleanor. Eleanor Marx was a brilliant cellist, providing the music to his math. However, in 2010, Eleanor was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. Arthur spent a king's ransom on experimental treatments, turning their home into a sterile lab. Despite his billions and his absolute control, she died 3 years later. Her death was the first time Arthur realized that nature could not be bribed. Elias Marx, Julian's father Elias was Arthur's business partner but lacked Arthur's iron discipline. While Arthur was a saint in a charcoal suit, Elias was prone to the same thrill-seeking vices that Julian eventually inherited. In 2015, Elias and his wife were killed in a high-speed boating accident off the coast of Amalfi, an event Arthur viewed not just as a tragedy, but as a sloppy, avoidable error. The deaths of Eleanor and Elias left Julian as the only remaining vessel for the Marx name. When Julian fell ill with bone marrow failure shortly after his parents' death, Arthur didn't see a nephew in need of love, he saw a failing piece of his own legacy that needed to be repaired. By funding the transplant using Victor Drazen's marrow, Arthur believed he was finally conquering the chaos that had taken Eleanor and Elias. He didn't realize that by fixing Julian with Drazen's DNA, he was creating the very anomaly that would eventually allow Julian to slip through the fingers of the law, at least for a while. Follow us as we explore the intricacies of how the same legacy Arthur Marx tried to preserve became his undoing. Inside his penthouse, Arthur was a man of cold, sterile rituals. Every morning at 4 a.m., the lights dimmed to a specific amber hue as he meditated, surrounded by rare manuscripts and medical equipment that kept his failing marrow at bay. He had spent decades perfecting his environment, believing that absolute control was the only cure for a chaotic world. His nephew, Julian Marx, was the chaos Arthur feared. Julian was 32, charming in a way that felt like a calculated risk, with the gaunt features of a man who lived on adrenaline and borrowed time. Years earlier, Julian had been a ghost, his body wasting away from bone marrow failure. Arthur, driven more by a selfish need to preserve the family name than by love, had funded a secret, experimental transplant. Julian received the marrow of Victor Drazen, a young marathon runner whose altruism was as boundless as his health. The transplant worked, but it did more than save Julian, it rewrote him. By 2024, the relationship between uncle and nephew had disintegrated into a cold war of resentment. Julian had traded his second chance at life for the high-stakes poker tables of Macau, accruing debts that even the Marx fortune couldn't easily erase. The breaking point came during a silent, rainy Tuesday. Arthur summoned Julian to the penthouse and laid a new will on the obsidian desk. He told Julian that the Marx legacy was a failed experiment. Every cent was being diverted to medical research. Julian was being deleted from the future. But Julian Marx had a secret buried deep within his bones, a biological loophole that meant he could stand over his uncle's dead body and leave behind a fingerprint that belonged to a completely different man. How do you convict a killer when his own blood provides a 100% DNA match to someone currently lying in a coma 10 miles away? The answer would force investigators to redefine what it means to be human. The murder was not an explosion of rage, but a surgical erasure. Julian knew the penthouse's security better than anyone, and more importantly, he knew the biological secret he carried. He spent 2 years watching Victor Drazen, his donor. When Drazen was involved in a tragic hit-and-run that left him in a persistent vegetative state, Julian saw his opportunity. He realized that as long as Drazen was alive but unable to speak, he was the perfect biological shadow. On the night of the crime, Julian entered the penthouse with the silence of a man who had practiced his movements for months. He used a needle to mimic a medical embolism, a quiet death for a quiet man. During the brief struggle, Julian intentionally let a drop of his blood fall onto one of Eleanor's glass trophy on the desk. He didn't wipe it away. He walked out, confident that he was leaving behind a signature that wasn't his. When Detective Sarah Miller arrived at the scene, the evidence seemed like a gift. The lab returned a perfect match to Victor Drazen. But Miller was a skeptic by nature. When she walked into the hospital room and saw the wasted, immobile form of Drazen, she knew she wasn't looking at a killer. She was looking at a victim of a different kind. The investigation pivoted into the bleeding edge of forensic science, chimerism. Miller discovered that Julian's secret transplant had turned him into a biological hybrid. Because bone marrow is the factory for blood, Julian's veins were filled with Drazen's DNA, while his skin, hair, and saliva remained his own. It was a molecular masquerade. To unmask him, Miller ordered a full-body mapping of Julian, a grueling process of collecting samples from every biological system. The results were a scientific anomaly. While his blood work screamed the name, Victor Drazen, the sweat and skin cells he had unknowingly left behind in a microscopic struggle near the penthouse air vents shouted a different name, Julian Marks. The legal battle that followed was a nightmare. Julian's lawyers argued with ironclad confidence that the blood DNA proved his innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt. But Detective Miller had one more card to play. During a pivotal moment in the interrogation, she looked Julian in the eye and delivered the blow that cracked his defense. The blood belongs to the donor. But your skin, your hair, and your saliva, that still belongs to you, Julian. The team performed a deep tissue scan, taking a buccal swab of Julian's cheek cells. The results were final. While his blood matched the man in the coma, his cheek cells matched the stray hair found at the scene. They had caught the chimera. Julian Marks was convicted of first-degree murder. The trial was a sensation that rocked the medical community, forcing a worldwide rewrite of forensic protocols. Arthur Marks got his wish in a dark, ironic way. His name became immortal, but not for his charity. He became the face of the case that proved even our most basic identity, our DNA, can be stolen. The case of Julian Marks did more than just close a murder investigation, it cracked the foundation of forensic law. We have always believed that our DNA is the ultimate truth, the one thing that cannot be faked, stolen, or shared. But in a world of advanced medicine and chimerism, that truth has become a shadow. Julian sits in his cell, a man with 2 sets of genetic code, proving that we are no longer just who we are born as, but also who we choose to become, or destroy. If your blood said you were one person, but your skin and breath said you were another, who would you actually be? Beyond the science, do you think Julian's crime was a failure of the law, or a failure of a family that tried to play God with biology? What do you think? Let's discuss in the comments. Is DNA still the gold standard of truth, or has the Marks case changed everything? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of science and legacy, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories where the line between human and monster is rewritten. Thanks for watching.